Welcome back to Human Biology with Dr. B. Today we're talking about muscles. It's one of my favorites. I know I always say that, but this is literally one of my favorites. All right, so let's talk about the different characteristics of muscles and muscle cells. We have all muscles, four main things. They are excitable, they are contractile, they are extensible, and they are elastic. They are excitable because they respond to stimuli, external and internal. They are contractile, meaning the muscle cell can actually shorten. They are extensible, meaning that they can then stretch. And they are elastic in that they always return to their normal size. We have three main types of muscle. We're going to primarily focus on skeletal muscle today. We'll talk about cardiac and smooth muscle with the cardiovascular system and then with the GI tract later. So three types: skeletal, cardiac, and smooth. Skeletal and cardiac, as you can see here, are both striated, meaning that the actin and myosin filaments are oriented parallel towards each other. Smooth muscle cells have more of an elongated, fibrous appearance, and the actin and myosin are not oriented in parallel. So what's the function? Number one, we need to move our body. Our muscles use our bones as levers in order to produce any type of movement, including talking. They are helpful to maintaining posture, supporting internal organs. That's basically what your abs are for. They push against veins and lymphatic vessels in order to return venous blood and lymph to the circulatory system, as well as generating heat. I don't know if you've ever worked out, but I don't know about you, I tend to get warm when I work out and maybe sweat a little, which is your body's response to increasing temperature to maintain homeostasis. So your muscles work in pairs. There's two ways that muscles work together. They work synergistically in that muscles contract at the same time, causing one movement. For example, you have four heads to your quadriceps, hence quadriceps. You have your vastus intermedialis, your vastus medialis, your vastus lateralis, and your rectus femoris. Those are all your main four quadriceps. Now, those work together to pull your leg up. Your hamstrings, that's our next one, antagonistic, is movement produced by muscles working on opposite sides of the bone. They produce separate movements. So the quadriceps pull up on the knee, moving your leg into a perpendicular from your body, and your hamstrings pull the leg back down. Both of these movements allow for walking, running, jumping, basically anything that involves your legs. The biceps and triceps are also a great example of antagonistic muscles, as you can see here. The biceps, the origin is up here on the acromion process of your clavicle, and the insertion is down here on the radius. Now, the biceps contract to move the radius towards the humerus. The triceps, however, again, the origin is up here on the coracoid process of not the clavicle. The origin of the triceps is up here on the coracoid process of the scapula, comes down here, inserts onto the, not the radius, the ulna, and contracts to pull the arm straight. So the biceps, triceps, antagonistic muscles, they work to move your arm in upwards and downward direction. Now the muscles attach, there's two main types of attachments. The tendons are what attach the muscle to the bone. Now, as we talked about in class, and we're about to talk about a little bit more, each muscle fiber is encased in what we call an endomysium. And then around the external portion of the entire muscle is what we call an epimysium. It's the outer covering of the muscle. This muscle tapers down at the end and then will become the tendon that is then attached to the bone and is contiguous with the periosteum of the bone. So it's all one fluid sheet of connective tissue that allows the muscles to physically pull on the bones. The origin of the muscle is the end attached to the bone that remains relatively stationary during movement. And then the insertion of the muscle is where the muscle is attached and what if that bone moves. So as we talked about, the origin of the biceps is up here on the acromion process near the clavicle from the shoulder blade, from the scapula. And that's the origin, and the insertion is down on the radius. And the function of the biceps is to move the radius closer towards the humerus, to decrease the angle between the humerus and the radius. Now the triceps is the absolute opposite. It increases the angle between the humerus and the radius, and actually contracts to move the ulna into a single line with the humerus. So the muscle structure, this is exactly what I was just talking about. So each cell in a muscle is what we call a muscle fiber. Now, a fascicle is a bundle of muscle cells that work and move and contract in the same direction. So here you can see this. Each one of these is one muscle cell, and they are bundled together by a muscle fascicle. You can see the muscle fibers here. The endomysium surrounds each fascicle, and then around the entire muscle is the perimysium. The perimysium, as you can see down here, the muscle tapers off, and the connective tissue is what is left, and that becomes the tendon that attaches the muscle to the bone. The perimysium becomes a tendon, which is then contiguous. It continues into the periosteum, so that the muscle physically pulls on the bone. This is basically the screw that holds these together. The sarcomere is the functional unit of a muscle cell. Skeletal and cardiac muscles appear striated because the myofibrils and myofilaments, so a myofibril is the myofiber, it's another name for the myofiber, each individual cell. A myofilament are the small proteins in the muscle that actually cause the contraction. In this case, it's actin and myosin. Now, in cardiac and skeletal muscle, the actin and myosin are oriented parallel to one another and then pull on one another in that direction. The sarcomere has each end is the Z line, or it's also called the Z disc. In the center of each sarcomere is the H zone. And the myosin filaments lie attached to the H, and the actin is attached to the Z. And then the sliding filament theory, which is on the next slide, says that the actin and myosin slide together to form a contraction. So muscular contraction occurs at a molecular level, which I just need you to think about for a second. Move your arm, like contract your biceps, and just think that that contraction is based on the sarcomere contracting and shortening its length. And what allows the sarcomere to shorten is individual proteins of actin and myosin. It just blows my mind every time. You can see it here. You can see the Z lines and the actin attached to the Z lines. You can see the myosin. This is the H band in the center. And you can see the myosin heads. This will become very important as we continue to discuss the sliding filament theory. What happens, the sliding filament theory basically says that actin and myosin pull against each other to shorten the length of the sarcomere. So this is how contraction actually happens. So here you can see this is the myosin head, and here's the actin. So what happens is this is active, so it does require ATP and energy. So number one, the myosin head hydrolyzes ATP and becomes reoriented and energized. Then the myosin head attaches to the actin, causing what we call a cross bridge. Then, when the ADP is released, the myosin head basically slides, still attached to the actin, causing that movement and the shortening. The myosin head binds ATP, and the cross bridge is released, and we call this kind of like a gun, how you can cock a gun before you shoot it. This is the cocking of the myosin head. It pulls it back, ATP is hydrolyzed, it reattaches, it slides, it pulls, and that is contraction. All of this requires ATP. And the cycle continues over and over again. Now, one of the biggest misconceptions is that when the myosin head releases and pulls back, that the contraction is complete. So what you don't see here is that the myosin heads are actually 360 degrees around, and they're kind of, if you were to have a rope kind of disintegrate, you would see all these pieces coming out of the rope. That's what the myosin heads look like. And the actin is all around. Remember, this is not 2 dimensions. This is in 360 degrees. So that's why you can contract, and you don't just pull against one and have this short movement, but you can actually pull and have a continuous contraction because the myosin heads are oriented in 360 degrees. So, troponin and tropomyosin. Now, this is on the actin filament. So you can see the actin filament. It's surrounded by 2 other proteins called troponin and tropomyosin. Now, the troponin tropomyosin complex and calcium ions work together to allow the contraction to happen. Now, calcium ions, we've talked about in class how important calcium is. Calcium is released into the muscle cell by the sarcoplasmic reticulum. It's on the next slide. And the calcium will bind here to the troponin, which, because this is a protein, any binding will cause a 3-dimensional shape conformation change. So what happens is this binds here, and it removes the troponin tropomyosin from the active heads, the active sites of the actin molecule, which allows for myosin binding. The sarcoplasmic reticulum is nothing more than the endoplasmic reticulum. However, for this particular type of muscle cell, it is specialized. Calcium ions are stored in massive quantities in the sarcoplasmic reticulum. You can see this here. The sarcoplasmic reticulum moves through almost like a webbing, and then around the sarcomere, it is 360 degrees. It is a 3-dimensional structure. We have what are called T-tubules and terminal cisternae. And the T-tubules on each side and the terminal cisternae, they make what we call the triad. And this is where the calcium is stored. And when the motor neuron activates this particular sarcomere, the calcium is released and then binds to the troponin tropomyosin. The myosin head can bind to the actin, and contraction occurs. So the neuromuscular junction. The neuromuscular junction is where the neuron attaches to a muscle fiber or a fascicle or a certain area of the muscle. Now what happens is the nerve impulse, your brain says, hey, I would like the bicep to contract. And this sends a signal to the motor neuron associated with the bicep, goes to the neuromuscular junction and says, hey, let's send a message to the muscle. So what happens in this instance is the neuronal impulse travels down the motor neuron. This is the neuromuscular junction where the neuron and the muscle meet. The action of the neuronal impulse causes acetylcholine. Acetylcholine is a neurotransmitter. It basically takes the message of the neuron and transmits it to the muscle. It is released into what we call, this is called the synaptic cleft. And the acetylcholine then binds on the muscle boundary and causes the neuronal impulse or the impulse to spread throughout the muscle. Now, when this impulse spreads throughout the muscle, remember, it's all it is electrical activity. It causes the release of calcium into the muscle from the triad, from the sarcoplasmic reticulum. You can see this here. And when the calcium is released into the sarcoplasmic reticulum, again, it binds to the troponin, which moves the tropomyosin off of the active site of actin. And then from there, the actin active site is revealed, which can bind to myosin, which then allows for shortening of the sarcomere. So a motor unit is one motor neuron and the muscle cells that stimulate. Now, in larger muscles, like our quadriceps, hamstrings, glutes, there are fewer motor units because if you have one motor unit in that area, it can actually cause a contraction so there can be as few as 3 motor units or as many as 300 motor units. It basically tells you how many neurons are innervating that particular muscle to cause contraction. Now, your quadriceps and your hamstrings, they move in one direction. They pull the knee up, basically they pull the knee up, or they release it down to standing. Now, because of that, there are fewer motor units in that area. It doesn't mean that the muscle cells are less stimulated. It just means that it's more of a gross motor movement. However, your fingers, now I want you to just move your fingers in front of your face like you're playing the piano. You can see that there are a ton of different muscles, a ton of various movements for your finger. Now, in your hands and your fingers, you have more motor units because it is much more of a fine motor coordination. So we would need different muscles to be stimulated at different times in your hands in order to produce writing, to produce movement, to produce any type of musical instrumentation. Basically, the more fine the motor movement, the more motor neurons, motor units, not urines, oh my gosh, the more motor units associated with that particular area. Now, all the muscle cells in a given motor unit contract at the same time, which is why larger muscle groups have fewer motor units and smaller muscle groups that produce fine movement have more motor units. Voluntary movement. Your skeletal muscles are voluntary. That means you can choose, essentially, whether or not those muscles contract. There are three major terms we need to establish here. So the first one is recruitment. Now, as we talked about, in your larger muscle groups, there are less motor units, and there are more motor units for finer motor coordination, such as in your hands. Now, recruitment is when you increase the number of motor units that are stimulated to increase the strength of the muscle contraction. Okay, so for example, I need you to think about sitting, just sitting down on your chair, sitting down on the pot. Either way, sitting down. Do you think it's going to take more or less muscle cells and therefore active motor units to sit down and to stand up than it will to squat 200 pounds? Think about it. The more weight put on a muscle, the more asked of the muscle, the more your brain says to your muscle, oh crap, I'm going to need more muscle cells to lift this weight up. Let's get it all together. Recruitment. That's what we call recruitment. Now, summation. Recruitment and summation work hand in hand, especially when standing up or lifting heavy loads. Summation is when a second stimulus is applied to a muscle before the first one has relaxed. So summation, if electrical impulses are sent continuously to a muscle, it will result in tetanus. Now, tetanus is not necessarily a disease that we remember as lockjaw, but it is. That's what we call it. Tetanus is where your muscles are so contracted that no relaxation occurs. And then we have the muscle twitch. Now, when you and I think of twitching, I think of drinking too much caffeine in the morning and then being twitchy throughout the afternoon. No, a muscle twitch is the contraction of a muscle to any stimulus. That's what it's called. So anytime you move, it's a muscle twitch. Twitches on their own individually are very brief and not part of normal movements. However, when more and more stimuli arrive at the muscle, this muscle twitch can then actually result in a gross motor movement due to summation. So here's what a muscle twitch looks like. If a muscle twitch is sustained, it causes a contraction. But this has to be in relation to frequent stimuli. Fatigue, after a muscle is stimulated, can actually set in, and this will be the time when the muscle can no longer be contracted, even when it's stimulated. Now, fatigue is not after you have a good workout session. Fatigue is an actual problem with the muscle where the muscle can no longer contract in this short period of time because it has been contracted so deeply. So changing the frequency of stimulation is another way to vary the contraction of the muscles. So here you go. Here's the stimulus. Now, when we talk about a stimulus, we talk about a neuronal impulse to the neuromuscular junction, releasing calcium and causing contraction. So here's one, single twitch, very tiny. Summation is where we have multiple. Your brain is like, oh, hey, I'm going to need more muscle cells here. I'm going to activate more motor neurons, and I'm going to increase the depth the tension on that muscle contraction. And then if the stimuli comes so quickly without any break, what happens is that tetanus, where the muscle remains fully contracted, can occur. Now, at this point, the muscle can only contract so far unless under the influence of the tetanus toxin. That's a whole different subject. Then at this point, stimulation ceases or fatigue will set in, where the muscle can no longer contract for a moment and relaxes. So how do we get all this energy? Well, ATP is, the answer. All muscle contraction requires energy, and ATP comes from 4 different sources in this series. So number 1, the ATP stored in muscle cells, then creatine phosphate stored in muscle cells, then aerobic respiration, and then anaerobic respiration. I love this figure. After 6 seconds of exercise, you've used the ATP stored in your muscles. After 10 seconds, you've used the creatine phosphate. This is only 30 to 40 seconds. This is where we are. 30 to 40 seconds, the ATP is generated from glycogen, and in some cases, we can push to the anaerobic threshold and require the body to produce lactic acid. At the end of exercise, we call this the EPOC, excess post-oxygen consumption afterwards. After you run or do a HIIT workout, you'll find yourself breathing heavily for a few minutes after. Like, you don't immediately stop breathing heavy once you finish the exercise. What happens is in that your body is taking in more oxygen than normal at rest in order to replace the oxygen used. And then after prolonged exercise, the oxygen debt is paid back. Fat is burned to produce more energy to replace that oxygen. It's pretty fantastic. We also have 2 different types of muscle fibers. We have fast and slow twitch muscle fibers. Now, slow twitch muscle fibers are those in your abdomen and in your back that require really great endurance. They contract very slowly, and they can maintain a contraction for a very extended period of time. These are very, very red. They have a lot of myoglobin. The myoglobin is there to have a stronger attraction to oxygen than hemoglobin. So that way, when these muscles are used over long periods of time, they never go into oxygen debt. And then fast twitch muscle fibers are white. As you can see them here, the red ones are the slow twitch and the white ones are the fast twitch. These contract rapidly, really, really quickly, very powerfully, but they cannot operate for that long over extended periods of time when compared to the slow twitch. They can make and break cross bridges more rapidly. They have more actin and myosin, and they typically rely on anaerobic metabolic pathways to generate ATP. So when you do, this is the big difference between aerobic exercise and HIIT, because HIIT, high intensity interval training, pushes you to your anaerobic threshold using your fast twitch muscles, which in order, it depletes them more rapidly. And then the goal is to push the anaerobic threshold so that over the next 12 to 24 hours, your body burns more calories in order to put back all the nutrients that you used in those muscles. Also, fast twitch muscle fibers are your long and lean is a very misleading term, but they are the leaner muscles in your body. And then how do you build muscle? You can either do aerobic activity or resistance exercise. Personally, if you want to maintain a healthy life, not get osteoporosis, not get arthritis, and stay out of the diabetes zone, you need to incorporate both aerobic activity as well as resistance exercise into your normal daily habits. Basically, get up, lift, run, eat, sleep, repeat for the rest of your life. And that's it. You should now be able to relate the structure of muscle cells to the function, describe the unique characteristics of muscle cells, understand how muscles work together, relate the structure of the sarcomere to the sliding filament theory, list the steps required for muscle contraction, analyze the role of calcium in muscle contraction, relate recruitment, summation, motor units, and voluntary contraction, and delineate between fast and slow twitch muscle fibers. Thanks for joining me. This has been Dr. B. I'll see you next time.